And we're good.
We're good as in we're going?
Yeah.
Oh. Hello, my name is Dr. Alexander Cummins. I'm a historian of magic, and I'm very interested in geomantic divination, which is what this video and hopefully a series of videos will be about. So I just wanted to outline, well, why geomancy? It's not necessarily a terribly well-known system of divination, certainly not as well-known as tarot or even the I Ching, which it bears certain structural similarities with. So, why geomancy then? Well, for a start, it's short and it's to the point. There are only 16 possible answer figures, although in a full chart, if you like a shield, there will be 15 of these 16 answer figures that will come up, and they might be repeats, and then you can look at how that thing applies to the other thing. But it gives very, if you forgive the double puns, very gnomic and yet very down-to-earth advice. These are answer figures like joy, sorrow, gain, loss. Then it has some slightly more esoteric ones: reddening, whitening, and then some downright bizarre ones, the caput and cauda draconis, which we'll talk about again in a minute. So, along with it being simple, it's also complicated enough to give accurate readings, and also allows both confirmation and denial, but also talk about some of the processes that are involved, and it might even mention things that haven't even been considered in the question that are then added to the reading. In other words, the last three figures of a chart, of a shield, are the witnesses and the judge. So the judge will give you your final answer, your final judgment on the question you're asking, whereas the witnesses will give explanations as to how and why, other things to bear in mind, qualifiers, subtle distinctions and complexities. Each figure itself also has its own mysteries. Each of the figures is arranged as an analogy with the I Ching, where a hexagram is 6 broken or unbroken lines. Geomantic figures are 4 broken or unbroken lines, usually represented with a star or a pin or a prick in the early modern texts, or 1 or 2. And each of those has an elemental correspondence, so we can see that the element is either active or passive, and this gives us a sense of understanding the figures in their own sake, as well as how they relate to each other. And there's also pictographic and ideographic meanings with them. So the figure of Rubius, for instance, is generally said to be a cup upside down, and I believe this has something to do with the process of cupping, which was a way of bloodletting, and Rubius, amongst other things, represents the shedding of blood. So the system is heavily reliant on astrological symbolism, which is to say it uses the symbolism without any of the astronomy. There are no ephemerides. Each of the 16 geomantic figures is awarded a planetary ruler and a zodiacal identity, with Leo and Cancer pulling double duty. And even the north and south nodes of the moon are represented under these mythic titles I mentioned of Caput and Cauda Draconis, the head of the dragon and the tail of the dragon, which represent the beginning of things and the ending of things, respectively. So one of the other things I like about geomancy is how varied the means of producing an answer can be. The process of divining itself can be using a pen and paper, can be making marks in the earth with a stick, where the system of divination gets its name, can be made by flipping coins, or really any other method of generating odd or even numbers, which are used to decide whether it's a broken or unbroken line for the quadrogram, if you will, of the figure. Now, the Renaissance occult philosopher Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa, who writes the seminal encyclopedia, the 3 books of occult philosophy, he mentions dice when he talks about geomancy, which is my favourite method, and I'd love to talk more about that in another video perhaps. Historically, geomancy is both clearly influenced by earlier Arabic and eventually earlier African divination systems, and while wanting to maintain the integrity of the study of each of those systems, it could be said that geomancy has this international heritage, which I very much like about it. Also, to look forward in time, there is a direct line that's made between the maths involved in generating a full chart and in the development of algebra, and eventually in the invention of the computer chip. For more on that, I would urge you to check out Ron Eglash's TED Talk, where he talks about exactly that. One of the other things that interests me about geomancy is the fact that in the modern age it seems, certainly in comparison to tarot, relatively unknown. Now, this is not simply a hipster appeal of being interested in a divination system you've probably never heard of. It's an underdog appeal, admittedly slightly, but also the fact is, in England anyway, in the late 16th and most of the 17th century, geomancy appears to be incredibly popular. It's experimented with, it's engaged with, and it's disseminated through a variety of occult texts and primers. It's also, interestingly enough, available and practiced widely, it seems, in the early North American British colonies, about which I'd like to do a whole video in of itself. Finally, I guess the thing that interests me specifically about some geomancy is the fact that, and this is a tentative area of my research, it seems that some early modern scholars and practitioners of it were suggesting the use of things that look like trance-like states or altered states of consciousness, whatever that ends up meaning. So we have, for instance, keen geomancer, mystic and occult philosopher Robert Fludd writing at the start of the 17th century on the importance of the anima mundi and the spiritus mundi, the soul and the spirit of the world. And he seems to be suggesting that this permeate the soul or attention of the diviner, and certainly seems to be talking about some kind of non-rational cognitive modality. Equally, the self-proclaimed Rosicrucian and astromagus John Hayden, who writes a long and very eccentric work on geomancy, also seems to suggest, instead of talking about zodiacal signs ruling or being associated with the figures, instead the angels or the spirits of those zodiacal signs. And he also seems to suggest that in some way, when the geomancer is making the marks upon the paper or in the earth in which to generate the figures necessary for a shield chart, that perhaps the spirit is guiding one's hand. And it's here, and as I say, very tentatively, that I suggest that there might be something to the notion of a not entirely negative portrayal of possession type states in a Western European magical tradition. And this again is a seed of something that I'm very, very interested in nurturing and seeing how it grows. So these are some of the reasons that I'm very interested in geomancy, and I hope to be making more videos about it in the future. Thank you very much.